Ko Karen Lavina Ho. Welcome to our Zoom presentation on our emissions budgets advice. We'd like to start off with a karakia. Whakataka te ho ki te uru, whakataka te ho ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi aki ana te atakura hai tio, hai hoka, hai hauhunga, tihe moriora. Before we get into the content this afternoon, I'd just like to acknowledge the team that we've got here to present our advice today and answer your questions. So on this call, you've got the emissions budgets and modelling team. And if you've been at our previous webinars, you'll recognise many of the faces that are here. In the emissions budgets and modelling team, we've worked closely with the sector teams here at the Commission to develop the analytical approach for emissions budgets, to carry out modelling and to understand the impacts of emissions budgets on Aotearoa. So we're going to present for about 20 to 30 minutes and then take questions. So if you have questions, please pop them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And we've got Charlie here from our comms and engagement team, and she'll be monitoring the questions and then she'll facilitate question and answers with the team here. Can we please pop up our slide set? Sorry, will just be one moment. Cool, thank you. We can just go to the second slide. So, Ināia, tonu, the time is now. Aotearoa has committed to reaching net zero emissions of long-lived gases by 2050 and reducing biogenic methane emissions 10% by 2030 and 24 to 47% by 2050. In our advice, we've outlined emissions budgets that will put Aotearoa on track to meet these targets. These budgets are ambitious, they're achievable, and they can be met in a way that is fair, inclusive, and equitable. Our advice shows that sustained and enduring climate action is affordable. Aotearoa can reduce emissions to meet its targets while continuing to grow the economy and improve well-being. Transformational and lasting change is both necessary and possible. The technology and tools Aotearoa needs to reach its climate targets all exist today. Chris is going to start out by outlining our recommended emissions budgets and how they've changed since our draft advice.
Cool. Thank you, Karen. So I'm Chris Holland from the modelling team. So this slide shows what our recommended budgets are from our final advice. You'll see there's some changes since we presented our draft numbers back in February. One thing to kind of note in all this is that these are the overall emissions budgets for the whole of the economy, and what we're showing here is the average emissions for each year. So emissions under our recommended budgets would reduce from 78 megatons in 2019 to an average of 72.4 megatons in the first budget period, which covers 22 to 25, and then reducing to 62.4 megatons in the second budget period, 2026 to 2030, and down to 50.6 megatons in the third budget period, 31 to 35. So these are total emissions across the whole of the economy, so including net emissions from long-lived gases and also biogenic methane. What this means is we're looking at a 7% reduction on average in the first budget period, a 20% reduction compared to 2019 levels in the second, and a 35% reduction in the third budget period. So what I wanted to do next is just talk through how we arrived at these numbers and how they changed from our draft advice. There we go. So the best place to look for this is a really helpful table in chapter 5 of our report, which breaks down what's changed since our draft advice. But essentially, there's three things have contributed to our emissions figures and recommended budgets changing. The first is updates to the greenhouse gas inventory. So in April, Ministry for the Environment updated the greenhouse gas inventory. And what that did is change the estimated level of emissions both in 2018-2019 current, but also increased the level of emissions. So essentially, MFE and other agencies have realised that we've been underestimating the level of emissions that we've been reporting, and through new research and improvements to the method, they've been able to refine that estimate. So essentially, we now understand that we're emitting more greenhouse gases than we thought when we were in our draft advice. The second thing that's changed is that we've received the evidence and assessed the evidence that we got through consultation, and that's allowed us to reassess some of our estimates of how quickly emissions could reduce in some sectors. In some areas, we've had another look at that evidence and seen that the emissions reduction potential is less than we previously thought, and in other areas we can go further, and we will talk a little bit further in this presentation about what those changes are. But essentially, looking at this table, moving from the top line, the draft emissions budgets, to the final emissions budgets in the middle line, that kind of combines both those changes in the inventory and the changes to the evidence we received. So you'll see the emissions level has increased from going from draft to final numbers in the middle row, and through those two changes. The other change we made is how we present our final budget numbers. And what we've done for our advice here is present our final budgets, which we're recommending the government put into regulations and enacting law, in using the IPCC's fifth assessment report, greenhouse gas metrics. This is essentially the exchange rate for converting between different greenhouse gases and comparing them all on a carbon dioxide equivalent metric. And what that's done is slightly increase the level of emissions in a greenhouse gas equivalent format. So that takes us from around 75 megatons in 2019 to 78. That's through a combination of greater weighting, greater impact of methane, and a slight reduction in nitrous oxide. But those three changes combined take us to higher levels of emissions for setting those emissions budgets. But looking at the absolute figures is one way to look at it. But what I want to do next is talk through what's the level of effort required under these emissions budgets and how's that changed. So looking at this graph, so if we just click on again, so what these two lines show, so the dotted line shows where we thought current policies would get us in terms of reducing emissions between now and 2035. And you'll see emissions are projected to decrease between now and then. This is mainly due to things like kind of starting to adopt electric vehicles and other mitigations which are going to be coming on. And you can see that changes to the inventory have increased the level of emissions, particularly after 2025. There's a bit of a gap there of a couple of megatons that's been caused by those changes to the inventory. And if we click on again, this is the projected path that we recommended for our budgets in the draft advice. And if we click again, this is the recommended path that we've recommended now for our final advice. And you can see that there's, similar to the current policy reference, there's a gap between where emissions budgets were and where they are now. And if we look at that, the difference between those two dotted lines and those two solid lines, if we think about that as the level of abatement required from the budgets, the kind of effort, if you like, if we click on, Charlie, if we kind of hone in on that, looking again, this is what the level of emissions reductions that were implied by our draft budgets were. And if we click again, this is the level of emissions reductions that are required under our final budgets. So you can see the overall level of emissions reductions we're asking from these emissions budgets stays broadly the same. And in some years it's slightly higher and some years slightly lower. And that's just because we've changed the assumptions we've made. So overall, while there's been a number of changes to the emissions budgets numbers, the reductions that we're asking and implied through these budgets stays very constant. I'm going to hand over to Karen again to talk through the principles and judgments we used in coming to this.
Thanks, Chris. So in developing emissions budgets, we pulled together a lot of evidence to inform us on how and how quickly we could reduce emissions in Aotearoa. We got a lot of feedback on this, and we made changes as a result of that feedback and as a result of new evidence. But that evidence only gets us so far. Ultimately, we also need to make judgments about the pace of the transition. So the Climate Change Response Act outlines a series of factors that we needed to consider when advising on emissions budgets. And when you look across that range of factors, you can group them in terms of achieving 3 outcomes. So the first is that emissions budgets that are fair, equitable and inclusive. The second, emissions budgets that are ambitious. And the third, emissions budgets that are achievable. On the right-hand side here, we have the series of judgments that we made informing our emissions budgets. A well-signalled transition, that's obviously key behind a just transition, and it means starting now and providing some level of predictability going forward. To not only meet targets, we also need to sustain targets beyond 2050. So we've recommended an approach that decarbonises as much as possible, while also building a long-term carbon sink to offset residual emissions, because achieving complete decarbonisation will be really challenging in some sectors. Part of our ambition is also contributing to the global effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. In terms of achievability, we've developed emissions budgets that can be met in light of uncertainty about how the future plays out, and we've actually shown several different paths that could reach the emissions budgets we've recommended. We've also considered the changes that need to be made and the practical constraints to making those changes, like how fast can we get electric vehicles into the country, for example, or how fast can we get infrastructure in place. And then to balance the need to be ambitious and achievable, we're recommending that we reduce emissions as fast as those real world constraints allow. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the pathways, and I'll pass on to Paul.
Kia ora koutou, ko Paul Young aho. So as Karen said, I'll give a quick recap of I guess the process we went through to arrive at the pathways that underlie our emissions budgets, firstly. So we started from looking at what is needed to meet the 2050 targets. So we designed long-term scenarios that satisfy the split gas 2050 target, as well as the 2030 biogenic methane target, under different sets of assumptions about how the future may pan out. And so this is discussed in chapter 6 of Ināia tonu. And we took insights from those long-term scenarios and combined those with the sort of the principles and judgments that Karen's just spoken to look at a path to 2035 that would underlie our budget recommendations. And we then, tested the flexibility of meeting that to ensure that there is sufficient flexibility around how that can be achieved. So the two charts to the right on this slide show where that what we've called the demonstration path, where that sits in relation to our range of longer term scenarios. And one thing to highlight in that comparison is that we've taken the approach of assuming no new agricultural mitigation technologies that aren't already on the market are available out to 2035, which is why on biogenic methane we're setting up towards that higher end of that scenario range. As Chris said before, no major sort of material changes to this from our draft advice. Okay, next slide, please. Shall I? So to speak a little bit to some of the refinements we've made between the draft and final advice. Chris has already mentioned, I guess, updates to our baseline, or the emissions estimates from the greenhouse gas inventory and some of our assumptions about the future under current policies. We've also revised some of our assumptions about mitigation actions, and some of the key examples are listed here on this slide. To speak very quickly to these, although we encourage questions people have on these on these topics. Sheep and beef farming, we have revised down the potential productivity improvements based on going back to the underlying evidence from the biological emissions reference group. In road transport, quite a number of changes, including a slightly slower rate of used electric vehicle uptake in the path, faster electrification of trucks, and changes around mode shift and biofuels as well. In the energy sector, we've refined our electricity price paths and the underlying modelling of that. We've revised industrial activity assumptions. Most of that is a baseline issue. And we also, our path now assumes a continued operation of some of the higher emissions geothermal generators. In waste sector, there's some higher ambition there in terms of the level of landfill gas capture that we think could be achieved and the waste diversion. So that's a very high level overview. I've highlighted on this slide the places where you can look in the reports for more information on these changes. Next slide, please, Charlie. Thanks. So just to highlight a couple of the sort of additions, I guess, from the draft to final stage again, we've put a bit more prominence to, or given a bit more prominence to our alternative paths to meet the budgets. So this is really to highlight, demonstrate the flexibility that is there in how the budgets can be met, building on our long-term scenarios and looking at different combinations of actions than what we have in the demonstration path. And we sort of broadly grouped these into the creatively titled alternative path A and B. The first one has broadly less technological change and leans a bit heavier on behavior change levers. And then alternative path B is sort of the opposite. Again, the details of this are in the report in section 7.9. And just really part of it is trying to reinforce the message that the demonstration path is not intended as a prescriptive path that must be followed down to the the ton of emissions. It's really trying to lay out an achievable path, recognizing that there's uncertainty about how much mitigation we can get from different sources in these budget periods. Next slide, please, Charlie. Another piece of additional analysis we've done for the final advice is some sensitivity analysis to some of the other factors which largely we're not changing across our scenarios. So these are things like population and GDP growth, some industrial closures, or for example with the aluminium smelter, which is assumed to close in our baseline case. What if that stays open? As well as some other selected uncertainties. And so there's a fair bit of detail there. Overall, this assessment sort of gave us confidence that the risks posed by these uncertainties are manageable, and strengthened some of our advice around the government, I guess, ensuring that there's sufficient headroom in their emissions reduction plan to account for these uncertainties. Next slide, please, Charlie. So we're now moving into the section around, I guess, the impacts of the budgets. And a significant piece of additional work we did was looking at a sort of a bottom-up costing exercise across key areas of the energy transition in our demonstration path. So this looks at the road transport, buildings, and food processing sectors, which together account for around 3/4 of the abatement of long-lived gases in our path. We've looked at how different cost components would change compared to our current policy reference case. So our baseline for looking at changes. And to give, I guess, an example of what that looks like for road transport, we're looking at changes to expenditure around vehicle capital and maintenance, fuels, including biofuels, electricity, including the network costs, the costs of delivery, and charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. It's important to highlight, I guess, the numbers here excluded the effect of efficiency and demand reduction measures. So it's really looking at the fuel switching component alone. But what we see overall is quite interesting in that there's higher investment and overall expenditure needed over the decade to come. But actually looking out further, we see the overall cost savings, which are largely coming from in the transport sector, are actually outweighing the additional expenditure required. So we're seeing overall cost savings relative to that current policy reference case, coming to around 2 billion per annum by 2040. So that was an interesting finding that we're happy to be able to bring through into our final advice. And here is where I hand over to Ināia to talk about the macroeconomic picture.
Kia ora koutou, ko Ināia Kinga hau. So this time round, unlike in the draft budget, we were able to find out the impact of our budgets on GDP. And we found that it's still a relatively small reduction in GDP. So in 2050, we're talking about 1.2% lower GDP if we implement our budget compared to our current policy reference scenario. And this is in line with what we were looking at in the scenarios that we ran in our draft budget. The biggest change is that for the demonstration pathway and for our final budgets, we are reaching net zero emissions in around about 2040, which is earlier than we were reaching them in the scenarios that we had included in our draft report. There are a couple of key things that we need to have this relatively small impact on GDP. One is that we need the successful rollout of electric vehicles, and the other is that we need to improve to make the on-farm practice changes. If we don't do that, we can still meet these budgets, but it has a larger impact on GDP. And that's because we have to reduce production more rather than relying on technology. And of course, this is looking purely at the price and production side of things. It's not factoring in co-benefits, the costs of delaying action such as more storms or droughts, co-benefits like health and that sort of thing. Speaking of health, I now pass it on to Carly to talk about health.
Sorry about that. Hi all, ko Carly Suaho. There'll be many health benefits from acting on climate change. A few of these are installing insulation for warmer, drier homes, which can not only increase comfort and reduce respiratory illnesses, but also for low-income households, save around $800 a year in health costs. There's also many benefits from reduced air pollution, such as reduced respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses. The social cost of air pollution cost Aotearoa around $4.28 billion each year, of which 22% are from vehicles. We've also found that studies show reduced indoor air pollution have positive impacts for the health of children. Studies have shown that children are 42% more likely to develop asthma if they live in a house that uses gas for cooking. And furthermore, increased walking and cycling will benefit New Zealanders in the form of more improved fitness, as well as cost savings. Walking trips less than 1 kilometre and cycling trips less than 5 kilometres could save $2.1 billion over New Zealanders' lifetimes. Now over to Karen for an overview on jobs.
Cool, thank you. And just before I get into this slide, if you've got any questions, just a reminder, put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So this slide shows shows the results of some of our analysis on how jobs in different sectors could be impacted by our emissions budgets. So in some areas, there may be fewer jobs by 2035, and in other areas, we may need to expand and there may be more jobs. So for example, we know that electric cars require less maintenance than petrol and diesel cars, and so there may be fewer motor mechanics by 2035 as we move to more electric vehicles. On the other side, we know that we'll need more renewable electricity as we electrify transport and process heat, and so there'll be more jobs associated with that. So much of the change that's shown in this slide will occur gradually over the next 15 years. And so some of that will occur naturally as people move jobs or as they retire. There will be some people that lose jobs as a result of the climate transition, and we particularly need to think about how we support those people through the transition, for example, through retraining and other policies and programs like that. But the other really important aspect here is that we need a nimble and responsive education system to ensure that we've got the skills that we need for the industries that will grow and the industries that will emerge as part of the climate transition. And we particularly need to be thinking about that in light of an ageing population and existing skill shortages, which we already have in some sectors. So just moving on to the last slide. So it's now time, it's now over to the government to decide whether they want to accept our advice and to shape climate action for Aotearoa. The government has to the end of the year to consider the Commission's advice, and by then they need to set emissions budgets and finalise the first emissions reduction plan for Aotearoa. And that emissions reduction plan will detail the policies it will use to achieve the budgets. From that point on, we'll be in a process of monitoring the government's progress and then moving on to deliver our next advice on the fourth emissions budget in 2024. At that point in time, we can also look at the second and third emissions budgets and decide whether they need to be reviewed as well. We also have a whole host of other functions that we will be moving on to in the coming months, including emissions trading scheme functions, reviewing He Waka Ināia, and also doing some more work in the adaptation space. So now we're going to move on to questions, and Charlie's going to come on and facilitate that for us. And Charlie, do you want to just mention to everyone about the session with Rod on Thursday as well?
Yeah, thank you, Karen. On Thursday at 1 p.m, we're holding a follow-up Q&A session to the Explaining Our Advice open Zoom we held on Friday the 11th of June. So if any of you came along to that, we're hoping to go through some of the questions we didn't quite get to cover in that session. And I can post a link to that in the chat shortly. But the first question we've got here is for Chris, I think. So are the budget's net emissions in the greenhouse gas guide, net emissions of 54.9 megatons of carbon dioxide for 2019, which is a lot lower than the 72.1 for 2019 in the Commission's advice?
Sorry, yeah, thanks for that question. So they are net emissions, but the question is, we need to be a bit more specific about what type of net emissions. So the figure that you're mentioned, the 74.9 megatons, is net emissions as reported by New Zealand as part of its international greenhouse gas inventory, and that includes all the changes in emissions, including all forests which were there before 1990. Whereas the emissions that we report, the change in emissions, the removals, basically take those emissions before 1990 as baselined, and so only report the emissions after 89. So it's a slightly different accounting for forestry that we use as part of this. And that's set out in our report in the chapter on measuring progress, if that helps.
Thanks, Chris. Paul, have you factored in population growth across the 3 budget periods, i.e. do you assume the New Zealand population remains at 5 million?
Thanks for the question, Rob. We have factored in population growth based on Stats NZ projections. So our central scenarios all have a population growth rate of around 1% per annum. So population grows to around 5.6 million in 2030 and 5.8 million by 2035. We've also, in the sensitivity analysis that I mentioned, explored the impact of higher and lower population growth rates, which are again based on Stats NZ projections and their range of uncertainty around those.
Thanks, Paul. Chris, the transition seems to effectively favour those with lower cost of capital. What are the costs of a just transition?
Yeah, so a lot of the actions that we're recommending kind of typically have a kind of high upfront cost and then repaid by savings over time, and that's potentially a barrier for some groups who might not have access, immediately have that money in hand to make that kind of investment or be able to access the capital. So that's why an important part of our policy advice is around overcoming those barriers and thinking about making sure the government designs policies so that we do have an equitable transition and that we don't disadvantage some groups. So that might involve kind of policies to support lower income households installing heat pumps, for instance, or to support some families buying an EV if that can save them money in the long run. So it's a really important part of our advice. I don't think it changes what we advise in terms of the actions, but it really is important when we think about what policies we put in place and who is affected by those policies. So it's a really good point to keep raising. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Ināia, in the draft advice, it was mentioned that there was no time to do sensitivity analysis in C-plan and DIME models. Was sensitivity done on the simplifying assumptions endemic in these models, and what did it show?
Okay, so we were still fairly time constrained in the time we had available to do modelling for this final run, but we were able to do some sensitivity analyses. So we had one where we looked at a combination of GDP and population, both higher and lower than what we had in the model. There was one on global oil price, one on the international emissions price, one on whether changing methanol production in New Zealand and when that stopped happened, and also one on keeping the Tiwai Point aluminium smelter open. And across all those sensitivities that we ran, we did find some sensitivity. So in the worst case scenario, I think it added an extra about 0.5 percentage point onto the GDP difference. But none of these were extreme or unexpected. They were in proportion to the changes that we put in. We didn't run those through DIME. That was a time thing. The key thing about DIME is that it uses results from C-plan, and the results you get out of DIME are quite closely related to what comes out of C-plan. So if the C-plan results are not showing anything too dramatic in the sensitivity analysis, then it's very unlikely that the DIME results will at the same time.
Thanks, Ināia. Karen, you state job change numbers, both negative and positive, in select industries, but do you have a simple aggregate across all sectors?
So it's not simple to aggregate things down, but what we can say is that overall there will be fewer jobs in some areas and more jobs in other areas over time. And what our analysis shows is that there are some real opportunities for jobs in some areas if we choose to pursue them. So for example, in native afforestation, if we were to create an industry there, there's a lot of potential for jobs, and that would be things like jobs in nurseries for supplying seedlings, labour for planting, fencing, pest control. There are also opportunities that come with that in honey and recreation and ecotourism and forest-based pharmaceuticals as well. So if we choose to pursue those things, we know that we can create more jobs from that as well.
Thanks, Karen. Chris, another one for you. Did you model the impact of actual higher ETS prices on behaviour changes versus just having shadow prices and assuming current settings?
Yeah, so the way it works in our models is effectively a kind of an emissions price, which we just need to be careful that we're not directly interpreting that as an ETS price. So there might be instances where other policies might be needed to kind of bring on some of that abatement. So we have looked at where higher emissions prices can drive emissions reductions, and that's really important in our modelling, particularly around the heat industry and power sectors, process heat. The level of the emissions price determines whether it's cost effective to reduce emissions through switching away from coal towards biomass or electricity. And also in transport, it affects the take up of electric vehicles, a return on that. So we have modelled it as an emissions price in the modelling, and we just there are reasons. There are other reasons why the ETS price might be slightly higher or lower because of other things which we haven't included in our modelling, such as kind of the stockpile of units, for instance. So we just need to be a bit cautious about how we describe that one. Thanks.
Chris. Paul, I think this one's for you, but I think you'll be able to post a link to this for Glenn. Where can we download the updated BR4 spreadsheet showing all the emissions details updated this year? Do you have anything to comment on that? Or?
Yeah, kia ora, Glenn. I assume by that you're referring to the spreadsheet or data set that we published for our draft advice, which I will post the link to the page on our website where we've published the updated data set and sort of assumptions workbooks. So that, that is, you can get there from the landing page of the Ināia tonu page, but I'll post the link in the chat.
Thanks, Paul. Sean, so what assumptions were made or changed in predicting higher future electricity prices?
Good question. So we updated our market modelling to reflect some of the market conditions that existed at the start of this year and still partially exist. So that was low hydro storage. So our base year for our base time for that, and then we also reflected the tight gas situation by constraining thermal generation until the end of the year. We didn't adjust our gas prices in the short term. There's some complex short-term market dynamics that are difficult for us to model well, but these are short-term. And we did a better job of aligning our detailed market modelling that we did with the energy link models with what we had in ends. So those are the reasons.
Thanks, Sean. That's actually all the questions we've received so far. So if anyone doesn't have any closing comments, I think we'll wrap up there. Is everyone happy with that? Yep. Thank you to everyone who's attended these sessions, and we have posted a link to the session on Thursday as well if anyone would like to join. But yeah, thank you for everyone here.